On this episode of the DAV podcast, DAV's Matt Saint-Sing sits down with Dr. Amelia Hall to discuss a transformative approach to veteran care at Naropa University. Many veterans arrive at her program feeling trapped by a label of disability, but Dr. Hall proposes a very different starting point. Join us as we look at how specialized spiritual and therapeutic care is giving veterans the tools to rewrite their own narratives.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Hall. Can you please briefly talk about what drew you into working with psychedelic, in the field of psychedelic science, and study of how you make meaning from those experiences?
Yeah. So it's a long story, but I've been working at this university, Naropa University, for 11 years. And we are what we call ourselves a Buddhist-inspired university. We're not necessarily a conventional faith-based institution, but we take a lot of inspiration and teachings from various Buddhist traditions. And that's my academic background. And so my background in Buddhist studies, particularly, and I would say all kinds of different spiritual traditions and contemplative practices, I think has given me a sort of lens for what has been emerging in the last few years around psychedelic-assisted therapy, and that we've been exploring what that looks like at our university. We're located in Colorado, so it's one of the few places in the country right now that has I want to say in brackets, legalized the use of psychedelics in certain ways for therapy. And one of the things that interests me is that I'm a scholar of Buddhism, and Buddhism itself has extensive frameworks for working with altered states of consciousness, visionary experiences, the transformation of perception or the understanding of perception, and also has very systematic approaches to working with the mind, working with emotions, and working with transformation. And a lot of those things seem to parallel the psychedelic therapeutic processes that we've been seeing. So I think, we have programs here in chaplaincy, we have programs in contemplative psychology. And so we have actually, 50 years really of models of consciousness, meaning making, and the nature of transformative experience, which we were founded in the 1970s. So our university was founded in 1974. And we offer a model of what we call contemplative education. And so we were bringing in modalities, things like mindfulness meditation, which back then was not a conventional thing to do in higher education at all. It was pretty fringe and has now been very, very mainstream. And I see that the way that we've been looking at integrating how can the use of psychedelics help. So we're not talking about, the recreational use. We're talking about how can these as medicines actually really help. And we try to bring an approach that is both clinical, therapeutic, but also works with people's spiritual backgrounds, whatever people's faiths are, whatever spiritual tradition or path they follow, whether it's Buddhist or Christian or Judaism or Islam or, any of those paths. But we see such a crossover and some ways that there needs to be some integration between the use of these and what actually happens in the therapeutic process, and the application of these medicines often mixes in with somebody's spiritual background. So they have things that come up in these sessions that really have a meaning relating to whatever their faith is. And so we're very interested in what that looks like. And a lot of the research that's happening right now is really looking at the clinical side. And that's incredibly important. But we feel that there's some other aspects too. and that we have a lot of experience in models of consciousness that some of them are over 1,000 years old, but are incredibly relevant, surprisingly, and I think extraordinarily so.
But I'm curious, how do you differentiate meaning from the clinical outcomes? A lot of attention is on like this, how do people feel when their symptom changes, right? There's less about, what are you taking away from this experience? I'm kind of curious how you kind of toggle back between those two worlds.
Well, so I mean, we're talking about, I think one of the things we're talking about is like subjective meaning, right? And what kinds of changes, lasting change after these kinds of experiences. And so we have data and research into reported increased wellness and support, and I guess more measurable in terms of like increased efficacy in terms of treating things like PTSD, for example. But the quality of the experiences that happens in that, the subjective quality of that, I think that there's a crossover between the benefits that come from a clinical outcome, but also that the, let's say, mystical experience that comes from that, which can arise from somebody's particular spiritual path, can also help make sense of trauma and reconnect with values, reconnect with kind of ethical values, and that there's this kind of let's say they would call, you might call it a noetic quality, or a sense that a really profound truth has been revealed, and that seems actually quite central to lasting psychological change. And so when we're looking at the results of this, that this kind of meaning making allows those who are, and of course, we're talking about veterans, a lot of the data we have is from the veteran community. But there are other trauma survivors, people that experience PTSD from other populations as well. But that it seems to the psychedelic assisted therapy, as well as what we're doing, which is trying to also understand how a person's spiritual experience and their own spiritual path seems to contribute to some kind of lasting psychological change. And what we've seen is that these experiences, a combination of these allows the patient, let's say, to reframe traumatic experiences, to integrate moral injury, to construct different narratives about their identity and who they are, because there's oftentimes who someone was, who they became, and then it's sort of like, well, what are you becoming? So I think that these things really need a lot of, I think the meaning making support is really, it was really, really important, because I think some of these powerful experiences, if they remain unprocessed, could actually create destabilization. Like it could be more destabilizing. And there's things about, I think that's really important, the container for that setting as well.
So, have you observed differences in how certain groups, say like military veterans or other people with just complex trauma, have you observed them constructing meaning? Have you talked to them afterwards? And if so, what kind of stands out?
Yeah, so I want to say that I'm not a therapist. I'm a scholar, I'm an academic, but I oversee a chaplaincy training program. So I'm not somebody that is sitting in a session with somebody going through this, but I have talked to a lot of veterans. We have a lot of veterans who are training to be chaplains in our program, and listened to their experiences, had conversations, and I've also given a lot of talks to therapists about the importance of meaning making in terms of what might come up in a session. And what happens is I've had a number of different stories of experiences where, let's say, somebody that has grown up in a tradition, let's say a Christian tradition, and they go through a session, and Mother Mary kind of comes into their minds and they have a conversation. Or there are veterans that I've talked to who, they've lost colleagues, they've lost brothers in combat. and that they've been able to actually have conversations, and that there's something about that that is incredibly healing, something that has been put to rest. But there also needs to be a kind of unpacking of that. And that often crosses over into what somebody's spiritual worldview is. And sometimes they'll have a vision that they don't really understand. And then you kind of say, well, explain it, like what happened, what was going on. And you might be able to, if you're informed about theology, if you're theologically informed about different spiritual traditions, then you're able to say, oh, this is actually something that is part of your tradition. You might want to explore that, because it might be actually giving you something that is going to be part of how you integrate this in the long term, not just in the short term.
It's almost like their religion might be a way of a, I think when we think about psychedelic experiences, a lot of people think we're like stumbling around in the dark. And when
Yeah.
they when you see a figure like, the Mother Mary, it kind of gives you a path, it gives you a map, if you will. And one example is there's a documentary on Netflix now called In Waves and War about
Yeah.
Navy SEAL. Have you seen it?
Yeah, actually, one of our students was part of that documentary and gave an introductory talk on that
Okay.
at the Boulder Film Festival. So one of our students, who's a former Marine, was interviewed for that documentary.
It's a very good documentary. But one of the things that jumps out at me is one of the Navy SEALs. He talks about his first Ibogaine trip, and he says he was on the set of The Wonder Years.
Yeah,
And so to
yeah.
me, to what extent is meaning making culturally shaped?
Oh, it's absolutely culturally shaped. And that is part of, I mean, I think that's part of where we come in terms of how do you integrate those things into, like, how do you make a meaning of that? What is the symbolism of that? And some of that can be worked through with a therapist. But sometimes I think that it's also, I think it's really important to have a combination of having a therapist and having somebody that is really grounded in the theology of different traditions. So, for example, like I use the example of Mary. You could see that, or you could unpack that with somebody and say, well, maybe she's your ally. Like she's showing up in a way as an ally to help in your healing. And what is it in your background that is a relationship that you might have had as a child, and it might be complicated, or it might be something that is that somebody could really draw strength from, and sort of see as an aspect of themselves that is representing something higher, something healing, that is actually integrated and is part of them, and that's also part of who they are, and that's something that they can always access. Does that make sense?
It definitely does. Yeah, it
Yeah.
definitely does. I want to talk a little bit about this mystical experience, right?
Mm.
This is a term that shows up in the academic literature nowadays. It shows up in the medical
Yeah.
literature. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you can just tell folks out there, what the heck is that?
You want me to define mystical
Well,
experience?
I mean, like, in a general vague sense. I don't want to put you on the spot, but for someone who's never had an experience like this, what would that mean for them?
Well, I guess I would push back on saying that there's people that haven't had this,
Okay.
because I think as human beings, we have a natural capacity to open up to presence, to open up to something greater than ourselves. And that can be as simple as being absolutely stunned by a beautiful sunset, or a moment where we have an expression, right, in English, which is time stood still. So I would ask you, Matt, have you ever experienced a moment where it felt like time stood still?
I have, absolutely.
Right. So even if it's just a small thing, like a moment, that is actually part of who we are as human beings. And it's not about, it's defined differently in different spiritual traditions, but it is that moment where time seems vast, where you suddenly don't feel singular or alone, that you're part of something. That experience is innately part of being a human being. And so that's a kind of on on a smaller level. And then you have these great mystics and saints and people in all the spiritual traditions that tap into that quality and sort of open up to it and kind of live in that. And all kinds of spiritual teachings and truths come out of that experience. But I don't believe that it is just special people or certain people that have that. I think that that's actually a natural quality of human beings.
That's an interesting point for sure. Yeah. Interesting. I'm gonna have to think about that later.
You need to sit
Definitely.
with that for a little bit.
Yeah, I think I do. Yeah, I need to, maybe I'll
Yeah.
sit in my armchair with my jacket with patches on the elbows and whatnot. But
Uh-huh.
I want to talk a little bit about your work at Naropa University, and
Yeah.
you're the advisor to the student veterans group there.
I'm the faculty advisor for our student veterans group.
What's it like working with veterans, and why do you think they're drawn to Naropa?
I love working with the veterans. I really appreciate I like their discipline. I would say as a professor, they always do their homework. um, they show up, but the veterans that come to us at Naropa have discovered that there's there are things that we're teaching here that have really helped them move through some pretty intense traumatic experiences, and that they're welcomed in our community and they're part of our family. And we teach things like meditation practices, body practices, all kinds of martial arts, yoga, art, and we try very much to meet them where they're at. I have seen an increase in veterans coming to our school. It just keeps increasing every year. And I think a lot of them, from my experience, have tried a lot of other things. They've tried a lot of medications, antidepressants, and quite a number of them have been suicidal over the last 10 years and have felt very, very alone. And it's sort of heartbreaking. And many of them who are honorably discharged and are labeled as disabled, they're on disability. My understanding is that they kind of start to get trapped in that identity of I'm broken and I can't be fixed. Our approach is to welcome anyone, and this isn't just veterans, but we have a lot of students here that have come from multiple different kinds of traumatic backgrounds. And we're not starting from the premise of you're broken. We're starting from the premise of how can we help you heal? How can we also help you integrate? We can't fix the things that have happened, but we can give you agency and joy moving forward. And that's also one of the things is like joy, to actually rediscover joy. That's incredibly satisfying to me to be a part of and to work with. And it's an honor, honestly. It's a privilege because I've also learned so much from them about their sense of camaraderie and care for each other is extremely inspiring to me.
Veterans, a lot of us we're drawn to mission driven work. We're kind of looking
Yeah.
for that next phase of experience and accomplishment. And I think for the folks who are enrolled in the divinity program there, they're going
Yeah.
to learn a lot of these tools, and they're going to go out into the communities and help. It's their own version of serving once again, to serve their community
Exactly.
this way.
Exactly. And they are so well placed to do that because they can then go into their communities and they understand, and they are, for them to go back into their communities as veterans who really understand the veteran experience and the trauma, and to show, okay, meditation and meditation and yoga isn't just some woo-woo thing. It's actually really helpful. And some of these psychedelic medicines is not a kind of recreational going out there and just sort of partying or something like that. Like this is actually really helpful medicine, mind medicine, body medicine, and and when appropriate, actual physical medicine that can really change somebody's life, where they're not stuck in a cycle of negative self-image, internalized pain, a narrative about an identity of like, I mean, I understand, like when I talk to veterans, like some of them have gone through things and they've done things then that they are not proud of and they don't like, and it's made them not like themselves and think that they are inherently bad. And we are trying to come from a premise of everyone is actually basically inherently good. And that's a kind of shift in a self-identity. If they can go out and serve these communities where they're working with people that look like them, that have their backgrounds, that feel like them, and they understand, then we are actually, as our program, like we feel like we're doing something that contributes to society and contributes to a population that is really suffering.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time here. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time. But I do want to ask: are there any practical steps for someone to explore meaning in a safe way after having psychedelic therapy?
Yes. I mean, one is obviously with trained therapists who have experience in trauma, who have experience in psychedelic work and that kind of integration. I would also say that from our perspective and what we're trying to do is that chaplains or spiritual directors who are trained in spiritual care that is particularly geared towards the psychedelic experience, and that it's non-dogmatic. There's a kind of pluralistic approach that honors a lot of different diverse beliefs, talking through kind of existential questions, talking through transformation, and I would say learning and having access to contemplative practices, whatever that looks like. So that covers a whole range of things. I mean, there's contemplative ways of doing everything. There's a contemplative way of tinkering in your garage and fixing up an old car, right? But actually making sure that there's a kind of ongoing touching in with that and cultivating it and understanding, because it takes time. It's not a magic pill that is just going to cure everything. So working with a therapist, but I would say actually working with, whether it's a rabbi or a pastor or a Buddhist priest or somebody that is like a chaplain that is grounded in the theology of those, and to explore like what kinds of things, maybe it's prayer, maybe it's running, maybe there's all kinds of things, but to actually develop a kind of ongoing, steady contemplative practice as well is extremely beneficial. And I've seen this with the veterans that we work with in our program, that it like an ongoing meditation practice, for example. Yoga, we found many of our veterans have found ongoing yoga practice incredibly beneficial as well.
What about for veterans who kind of don't have a religious background, or don't have like that tradition? Can there be a secular stand-in for that?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we're doing. So we've just launched a interfaith spiritual care degree, which has a specialization in psychedelic care, but it can also be interfaith. So even if you don't have like a particular tradition that you feel that is part of your life, as I said, when you asked me about mystical experience, everybody has a sense of expansiveness, beauty, presence in their life. And that could come through art, it could come through music. There's all sorts of ways. So when I say contemplative, that's what I'm talking about. So it doesn't actually have to be attached to a particular tradition, but it's a way of touching in with that feeling and that experience, which is, I think, natural to all of us.
Dr. Amelia Hall, thank you so much.
To learn more about Naropa's undergraduate and graduate degrees in clinical mental health, counseling, spiritual care, or even yoga, visit naropa.edu. That's naropa.edu. Veterans are a vital part of the community, making up about 10% of the student body, so you'll never have to walk the path to healing alone. And for more resources on the breakthrough benefits of psychedelics, head over to dav.org/mindscapes. Your path to a clearer perspective starts there.